Rosh Hashana, Daf Chet. Today we have a lot to do. We're continuing in our journey through this Mishnah. It's really a wonderful Mishnah because it touches on so many things. So we get to learn a little bit about each one. And so we've covered the Nisan and we started with Elul. And so today we're going to talk about the Ma'aser Behema, which has a machloket. And then we're going to get into, that's Elul. And then we're going to get into Tishrei and talk about Shanim, Shemitin, and Yovelot. For each one of these, we're going to ask for the source and if there's any differing opinions. So we begin with Ma'aser Behema, anything that's born from, this is the Tanakama, that's the anonymous opinion of the Mishnah, says Elul, from one Elul, Rosh Chodesh Elul to the next, you have to count a tenth of that and take from that group of animals that were born, a tenth and give them to the Kohen. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, they say no, Achad b'Tishrei. So according to them, you wouldn't count Elul for anything. This is included in Tishrei. So now let's see what is the reason behind the machloket between the Tanakama, who we already identified as Rabbi Meir in this case, and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. So we began Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon Achad b'Tishrei. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ushnehem mikra echad darshu. Shnehem means Rabbi Meir on the one hand, who says Elul, and these two sages who say Tishrei, even though they disagree, they learned it from the same place. How so? Shneimar, Laveshu charim hason, v'makim ya'atfu bar, yitro'au af yashiru. From Mizmor 65, it's a bit of a difficult pasuk. It has three parts. The first part says that the sheep were wearing karim, is something fine. They were wearing wool. They're wearing their nice wool suits. Maybe referring to the fact that the sheep are all full of wool and ready to be sheared at this point. So this is so nice that we're looking forward to this income if you're a farmer. And the meadows are full of grain. So you see, it's describing a time when everything is growing beautifully, all the grain, and they are singing for joy, right? And you just look around at nature, everything all ready for harvesting. That's what the pasuk is describing. The rabbis here are going to take the first part, Laveshu charim hason, as referring to the time when the sheep will become pregnant, which is going to be when, well, sometime around when the harvest, when the harvest is ready. That's because the next two parts are going to be taken to when the grain is ready to be cut. So let's see how this works. When are the sheep becoming pregnant? When there's grain all around in the field. And that's the springtime. And when do you look out and see all the grain fully grown? Ba'adar. So Adar is when the sheep are becoming pregnant. Small animals like sheep and goats, their gestation period is 5 months. So if they become pregnant, if they conceive in Adar, they're going to give birth in Av. Rosh Hashana shelahen Elul. Since the majority of these animals give birth in Av, so you want to have the first opportunity right after that, Rosh Chodesh Elul. That's the right time to count them and then give your tenth. Good. So that makes sense. Now we understand Rabbi Meir why he says Elul. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omrim, they say we agree with the same pasuk, but we read it differently. They skip the middle part and they go straight to the third part. When do they conceive? The sheep conceive when everything is all happy and joyous. When are the stalks singing? Not, they don't literally sing, but when they become very tall and then they rustle in the wind, so they sound like they're singing. Very beautiful poetry. So we're not waiting for when they first grow, but when they're finished growing. And when is that? In Nisan, not Adar, 1 month later. And therefore 5 months after that, from the time they conceive till they give birth, mitabirot benisan v'yodot be'elul, they give birth. Rosh Hashana shelahen Tishrei. So then you wait till after most of them give birth, and that will be Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So that's the question. Are you waiting from when exactly do the sheep conceive? Is it during Adar or during Tishrei? And both of them learn it from this pasuk. We're going to reject this. This is all said by Rabbi Yochanan, but we're rejecting it because the pasuk actually reads better only one way. Ha ketiv yitro'au af yashiru. Wait, first we ask one about the other. According to the Bimeir, doesn't it also say that the grain is singing, which would suggest Nisan? Hahu ba'alafta davyan benisan. Oh, that's the late ones. There's always some latecomers, right? Most of the sheep are Adar, and these lazy ones, they wait till Nisan. We don't have to worry about them. The pasuk is including them too. Fine, but we're not going to decide the halacha based on them. In other words, that they might give birth after Rosh Chodesh Elul, so then they'll be the first ones for the next fiscal cycle. Now the other two rabbis, don't they agree? The middle of the pasuk says when the valleys are wrapped in grain. That's talking about Adar. So what do you do with that? No, that's the early ones. Early bird catches the worm. These are overzealous sheep. So they go earlier, but we're not going to decide the halacha, the cutoff, the deadline based on these early ones. We have to wait till most of them. Okay, good. Now, bishlama l'Rabbi Meir kedichtib labeshu karim hason bizman shamakim yatfu bar v'kaname yitrao af yashiru. So now, with this pasuk reads better according to the Rabbi Meir, because here it says that the sheep are conceiving when the grain mostly grows. And also there's a few that wait till they're singing till later. So it makes sense for the pasuk not only to go in chronological order, but to also put the main one first and then the minority of the sheep second. So it reads fine according to Rabbi Meir. Assuming again that we're not going in chronological order, but in importance. So when do the sheep conceive? At the time when the grain is singing in Nisan. It should say that first. And then it could also add, and there's a few that go earlier in Adar. And so you see that it doesn't read quite as well for the Elazar and the B Shimon. So therefore, Rava comes and gives a new interpretation altogether. Ela amar Rava, tekula amar laveshu charim ason bizman shamakim yatfu bar ba'adar. Everyone agrees with the first reading we just had, which is Rabbi Meir's. So in other words, everyone agrees that the majority of the animals conceive in Adar and give birth in Av. And okay, so then what's the machlok? They're arguing on this pasuk. So it's not only because it says the word aser twice, although there is a different famous drasha on that. Aser bishvil shatit asher. From the double language we learned you should give a tenth so that you'll become rich. Okay, but that's just the derasha. The rest of the pasuk says, "Ma'asar deganecha tiroshecha v'yisarecha ubkorot bekarecha v'sonecha." You have to give a tenth of the grain and of your animals. They're all included together with one pasuk, and if they're included together, we're meant to compare them. So now, what's going to be the impact of this comparison? Two opinions. Rabbi Meir savar makish ma'asar behema l'ma'asar dagan. Masar dagan samuch ligmaro isuro, haf masar bema samuch ligmaro isuro. So just like regarding grain, when is it finished? Finished means that we cut it, we left it out all summer to dry, and it became nice and dry. So it becomes finished at the end of Elul, and then immediately in Tishrei, we say, that's it. It's complete. So just like with grain, we take the first opportunity after completion to say that this is the deadline, which is Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. So too, regarding Masar Behema, we should go to the earliest ending. And when is that? Well, since most of them give birth in Av, and everyone agrees with that, we should take the first opportunity, and that is Rosh Chodesh Elul. So Rosh Chodesh Elul is for animals, as Rosh Chodesh Tishrei is for grain. They're both the earliest opportunity to make the deadline. That's Rabbi Meir. He agrees. We're going to compare the two, grain and animals. Ma ma'asar dagan Rosh Hashanah shelo Tishrei, af ma'asar behema Rosh Hashanah shelo Tishrei. So he makes the equation more simply. Just like for grain, it's Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, so too for animals, the deadline for the fiscal year of tithing is also Tishrei. So it's a good point. When you ever have you're comparing two things, are you comparing the result, or are you comparing the reasoning that went to the result? And so you see, this is the essence of their machloket, how to read the comparison from the pasuk of aser te'aser. All right, so that's all we have to say about the tithing of animals. And now we get to the next line, Behad b'tishrei Rosh Hashana lishanim. So this Tishrei is the first year for years, first month for years. So that applies to us nowadays that we updated to 5782 in Tishrei. But what's the practical significance? What's the halachic significance to this? Because in times of the Talmud, they didn't count for most things, they didn't use the years of creation. So they used different kinds of years from the rulers. So let's see what the practical effect is. Lemai hilcheta, amar papad ishtarot. This is whenever we're going to write a contract, and you have to write the year in the contract. You have to write the correct year, otherwise it's no good. And so therefore we have to know if we're writing the year to a certain king, then the king shifts from one year to the other in Tishrei. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a second. Titnan, shitrei chova muktamin pesulin v'meucharin kesherin. Why is it so important to know the date of when a contract is written? Because we have a rule, the Mishnah says, that a note that is antedated is invalid. If it's postdated, it's okay. Now, what's the reason for this? For a promissory note? Well, anytime you loan money with a written contract, then the borrower's land is liened to that loan, and therefore, the earlier the loan, that lender has the first lien. So, if someone lends money today, but they write a contract from last week, then they'll get the lien earlier than someone who lent the person money yesterday, and that would be unfair, and therefore that would be an invalid shtar. So you got to make sure to get the date right. So it does have practical significance. Okay, just a practical application that we once mentioned is regarding a ketuvah. And ketuvah, it happens a lot that someone writes a ketuvah during the day, and then expecting that the wedding will go off before sunset, and then things get delayed and it goes late into the night. And so officially that would be a shtar mukdam and would be pasul because it has an earlier date on it, even though it actually takes effect only once they're married at night. And therefore, there are in fact some poskim that say that is a shtar pasul, the ketuvah is pasul, and you have to write another one. I just spoke to Rabbi Shama, and he remembers that all the chief rabbis of the community, all the rabbis of the community would do this, and they didn't worry too much about it. It happened, they wrote it during the day, and it was fine, it was okay. And many poskim say it was okay. Why is a good question. So one line of reasoning is that nowadays, even though in the olden days they would do kiddushin, and then after they would only finish the marriage a year later. So sometime in the middle they would write the ketuvah, and they didn't want the ketuvah to take effect until the time of nisuin. Nowadays, however, we do everything in such close proximity. So therefore, generally we can assume that the husband is willing to actually declare himself obligated in the ketuvah from the time he signs it, even though they're not technically married yet. He's like, I'll take care of you from now. I will provide your food, shelter, clothing, and everything from the time that they sign. And they do a kinyan, and he takes the handkerchief. And so since he's is in fact obligating himself from the time of the signing, so then that is the real date. If in fact that's, he knows that he's doing that. And so therefore, even though technically he wouldn't have to pay the ketubah until they're married, if he does decide that he's okay with paying it, then it is the correct date. And so we can rely on that reasoning for the practice done today. If you do the opposite practice and write it at night, and write the nighttime, the next day's date, even though you're doing it today, it could lead into a different problem, like Ralph mentioned one time, which is then they'll be married and not have a valid ketuvah during those few hours, and a couple is not allowed to be together without a ketubah. So that is standard practice. I think nowadays we try to get it right, but if we do write it during the day and it ends up going off at night, I think most rabbis say that it's totally fine. Okay, so that's just a related practical halacha to this. So now, since we said that the Shanim, Rosh Hashanah, the Shanim is for Ketuvah, so because the king, who we're writing the date to, updates his years in Tishrei. Now we have a question. We just said a few dapim ago. It wasn't that long, right? It was only 6 dapim ago. We said that it's Nisan is when the kings update their years. And back over there on Daf Gimel, Rav Chisda said, who cares? Who cares when the kings count their years? We need to know for Shtarot, the same thing. So this seems to be the opposite of what Papa said over here. What this Mishnah, part of the Mishnah says. So, as we discussed already, there are different ways of counting in different dynasties. So the kings of Israel, they count from Nisan, which at least one of the kingdoms, the northern kingdom, counted from Nisan. And foreign nations, at least the Persians, they did count from Tishrei, and therefore you have to know what dynasty you're talking about. If you find, a shtad from some ancient time, you have to know what their calendar system is, and that can have a practical monetary effect. Good. Rav Chisda matnitin. Okay, now we have a good question. You just quoted Rav Chisda, but back on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, Rav Chisda said, Lo Shanu, he was talking about the Mishnah, and says the Mishnah that says Nisan, that's only for Israelite kings and not for non-Jewish kings. They would be Tishrei. Yeah, but we just learned that in this clause of the Mishnah, that is Tishrei, and we explained it. So is Rav Chisda, when he said Lo Shanu, is he just teaching us what the Mishnah already said? If the Mishnah already makes a distinction that says sometimes it's Nisan, sometimes it's Tishrei, then you wouldn't say Lo Shanu, only explaining that one. And he's telling us something that we're going to learn in the Mishnah anyway. So it's not the right language. So why did Rav Chisda tell us something that we're going to learn anyway? So Rav Chisda no, rather Rav Chisda's statement back there continues, and he learns it from Pisukim. If you remember, he quotes various Pisukim that show that the Persians, from Nehemiah, right, to show that the Persians follow Tishrei. So Rav Chisda's chidush there were the Pisukim, even though it is the obvious explicit explanation of the Mishnah. Okay, good. So that's one answer. Now we're going to offer a different answer to this question of Rav Chisda. How come Rav Chisda explained back there that Nisan only refers to Israelite kings and not others? What about our clause? So this is a second answer, a second explanation of our Mishnah, totally different. When it says the word shanim, it's not telling us shanim for the purposes of writing something in a shtad. That's answer number one. Answer number two is for the cycles of the seasons. We have to know what season comes first during the year. Why would you need to know what season comes first? And he would say Tishrei, so fall comes first. Well, you need to know that when you're calculating the cycles of the sun and the moon, and that makes a difference for Birkat HaChama, which we bless the sun every 19 years. And if you're calculating the molad of the moon, you have to know which comes first. So therefore, that also has important effect. And this would assume the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the world was created in Tishrei. We're going to see soon that there is another opinion that says the world was created in Nisan. Okay, and that's the second. That was the second. Now we have a third interpretation of the word shanim. And we're not talking about when to write the date in the shtad. And we're not talking about to know the seasons, but rather for judgment. That Tishrei is the new year for new month for years, for regarding the judgment of the world. As we know, Rosh Hashana is a day of judgment. The Torah doesn't say it. Torah just calls it Yom Teruah. So how do we even know that Rosh Hashanah is associated with judgment of the world? We're going to see the source right now. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar ledin tichtiv mereshit hashana ve'ad acharit shana. Mereshit hashana nidon ma yeheh besofa. This pasuk in Devarim is praising the land of Israel and says this is a land that Hashem looks at. His eyes are always upon it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So in Peshat, which is saying Hashem is always has providence over Israel. But you see, the context there is talking about rain. And so Hashem provides it rain when the people are worthy of it. unlike Egypt, which relies on the Nile. So on the one hand, Israel is dependent, but that's a blessing that we have Hashem's direct providence. Now, since it says beginning to end of the year, so it means the Midrash says that at the beginning of the year, they will be judged on how much rain they will get by the end of the year. Now, when is the beginning of the rain season? Tishrei is the beginning of the rain season in Israel. So that's the judgment time of Tishrei, and was when is decided how much rain there will be for the rest of the year. Okay, so that's a very important derasha. But the Gemara adds another layer to it. Now, how do you know exactly it is Tishrei? I mean, I think that it's implied within the pasuk itself, but we learn it yet another way. Dichtiv. Tiku b'chodesh shofar b'keseh leyom chagenu. Mizmor that we actually recite on Rosh Hashana that says you should blow on the, now Chodesh can mean month. It could also comes from the word Chadash. It can mean Rosh Chodesh. So when we don't specify a date within the month, you just say Chodesh is the beginning of the month. So you should blow on Rosh Chodesh a shofar on the hidden time for our holiday. So what is this referring to? Ezehu Chag she'achodesh mitkaseh bo, Haveh omer ze Rosh Hashana. What holiday is there where it's bakeseh, that the moon is hidden, that there's no moon? Well, there's only one holiday that falls out at the beginning of a month, and that is Rosh Hashanah. All the other holidays are in the middle of the month or near the middle when you have a full moon. Good. Now, why do they go through this to this? Why don't they just say, oh, Tiku b'chodesh shofar? Any other holiday that you blow a shofar? Just that by itself, wouldn't you know it's Rosh Hashanah? The answer is not necessarily, because the Torah says Yom Teruah, and Teruah can mean blowing trumpets. In fact, probably usually means just blowing trumpets in the Torah and in the service in the Mishkan. And so therefore, this might be also an additional source for how we know that we don't blow trumpets on Rosh Hashanah, that we blow a shofar. So this is a really important connection that we're making here. And it's all coming from the keseh, the fact that there is no moon, or new, just barely new moon on this holiday. And now the next pasuk in that very mizmor says, "Uchtiv ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat leElohei Yaakov." Okay, so the pasuk is saying that this holiday that's on the beginning of the month, and we blow shofar, this is Rosh Hashanah, is also a day of judgment to Israel. So that's how we know that Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, is also, we blow shofar, and it's also Yom Hadin. So this is a fantastic Gemara. Finally, we're actually talking about Rosh Hashanah. This is the first time we're actually talking about the holiday in this Masechet Rosh Hashanah. Okay, good. So now a couple of agadot about this pasuk. Tenor Banan ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat leElohei Yaakov melamed she'en bet din shel ma'ala nichnasin ladin ela im ken kiddeshu bet din shel mata et hachodesh. So the pasuk, if you look carefully, has parallelism, but you see the chok is parallel to mishpat. LeYisrael is parallel to Elokei Yaakov. Well, wait, is that really parallel? Yisrael is talking about Israel, humans. Elohei Yaakov is talking about God. So mishpat, so maybe you could say, but God is doing the judging. But taking exactly as parallel, this amazing midrash, and there's further accounts of it, says as follows: how does the Bet Din up above know the calendar? How do they know when Rosh Hashanah is? Right? Do they get the school calendar in the mail? No. They ask Bet Din Shalmata, oh, is today Rosh Chodesh or not? Right? Because as we know, Rosh Chodesh is declared not based on calculation, but back in those times based on witnesses. And the witnesses can come whenever they come. And it's the Bet Din that has to process the witnesses and accept them. And they declare either today is Rosh Chodesh or tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. There's a more expanded version of this that says the angels go to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and they say, when's Rosh Hashanah going to be? And Hashem says, why are you asking me? Go ask the people. Go ask the Bet Din. Or yet even another version that says up in heavenly court, they set up the whole tribunal, the chairs, the stage, and they get the lawyers ready. And then they hear that the Bet Din down below said, oh, today's not Rosh Hashanah, it's tomorrow. So then Hashem says, okay, take away all the furniture, send home the lawyers and the court stenographers, because the Bet Din down below said tomorrow is Yom Hadin, and then they all come back tomorrow. I think it's showing the the mutual relationship between the Bet Din Shamala and Shamata. We, all humans, depend on the Bet Din Shamala to decide our fate. On the other hand, Bet Din Shamala relies on the Sanhedrin down here to decide when the date is going to be. All that is encoded in this pasuk that says, Chok Israel hu mishpat for Elokei Yaakov. In other words, there's a judgment time both of humans and the one that Hashem has to rely on to even know when the day is. Okay, very cool midrash. And Tanya idach, or another interpretation of this pasuk, Kichok liYisrael hu, and li'ela liYisrael motala minayin. I only know that the Jewish people are judged on Rosh Hashanah. How about all the other nations of the world? A judgment for the God of Jacob, and he's the God of everyone, so he judges everyone. So if Hashem is judging everyone, why do you have to even mention the Jewish people? We're included in the whole world. That the Jewish people is first. And this is compared to a king being judged along with his population. Let's say a king did something wrong, and also the public did something wrong, and they're all coming before court for judgment. Right? Only in Israel would there be such a thing that there's an independent judiciary that could bring the king to justice. And anyway, who goes first? The king goes first. Mishpat abdo u'mishpat ammo. This is in King Solomon's speech. After he finishes building the Bet HaMikdash, he says, Mishpat Abdo, he's referring to himself, and he's the king, and only then Mishpat Ammo. Now, what's the reason? My ta'amai b'etem, two reasons. Lav orach ad'al mikamalka abarae. It's not nice for the king to have to wait. He's going to be the last in line while everybody else goes for judgment first. No, he gets first right, even though it's to be judged, but nevertheless, he shouldn't have to wait online. Or another reason is because if you're getting judged by a judge, you always want to be first, because in the morning, the judge is fresh and awake and in a good mood. As the day goes along and there's more and more cases, he gets in a worse mood and he's more angry at all the bad things that people do. And so therefore, his mood may be worse. I often wonder about that when I'm grading tests. A lot of times, the first test, I'm in a good mood, and then, after an hour, I'm sick of this, and I don't want to grade them, and heck they did everything wrong. So I wonder if the way I test the first student is the same as I test the last student. I've never done a study really. Okay, and that's what we learned about the Shanim. We had three different interpretations of Shanim, whether it refers to the Shtarot or the seasons, or being a day of judgment. And so this is a very important source for understanding all the meaning, symbolism of Rosh Hashanah itself. And then we get to Shemitah years. Shemitah year begins in Rosh Hashanah. And anyone living in Israel right now knows this very well, because this year is Shemitah, and just a month ago, starting in Tishrei, all the produce has to go through the whole process in order for it to be allowed to eat. So minalan, what's the source that Shemitah starts in Tishrei and not any other time? Tichtib, Beshana Shebeit Shabbat Shabbaton Yelaris. So one pasuk says, in the year of the seventh year, it will be a rest for the land. We're going to make a Gezer HaShavah. This is the word Shana here. It says the word Shana in the pasuk that we just mentioned in Devarim, and we proved over there that it's talking about Tishrei, beginning of the year to the end of the year, the rain season, and therefore here also Shana is referring to Tishrei. Hold on, we ask. The word Hashana, it's a pretty common word. It appears also regarding Nisan. That's the first month. So say that maybe Shemitah starts in Nisan. And the answer is no. Danin shana she'en ima chodashim mishana she'en ima chodashim, ve'en danin shana she'en ima chodashim mishana she'yesh ima chodashim. We already saw this reasoning the opposite way. So we're going to derive a plain word shana from a plain word shana. And in this pasuk it says chodshe hashana, which is a modifier. So that phrase does appear in another place where we already made a Gezer HaShavah the other day from this pasuk. But if you have just plain shana, then we should get the other pasuk that's more fitting, which is this one. And so therefore, Hashana Shevi'it refers to Tishrei. And that's all for Shemitah. And now we get to our last topic, which is Yovel, counting 50 years. We don't count Yovel today because we don't have the majority of Jews in Israel. Although, I don't know, it depends, depending on how you count, we may be there or be very close to there. So we're going to have to know these laws of how to count Yovel. Anyway, Yovel, we count on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. That's what the Mishnah
Rabbi,
says.
Do we know, I'm sorry to interrupt. Do we know what year the Yovel is? Like, we know Shemitah, right? We're in a Shemitah year. Do we even know what year Yovel is? Because we don't really track it.
So we don't count it at all because of this time. We would actually have to start counting from scratch should the Mashiach come, and then we'll actually have to start the whole process. It's going to be very complicated. Okay, but it is a historical question. If you want to go back, there are historical records. Even to figure out when Shemitah is very complicated because there are notes in ancient sources and Josephus. So that was a Shemitah year, or in the Talmud, some story that was a Shemitah year. If you want to go back and try to figure out what year that was, right? Can we then calculate back when all the Shemitot were? So a lot of people try to do this. It's very complicated and different ways to do it. But it's a good question. Yovelot be'achad betishrehu, yovelot b'asara betishrehu, dichtiv b'yom kippurim ta'aviru shofar. We don't start the Yovel on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. We started on Yom Kippur. Here's the Pesukim. V'abata shofar teruah b'chodesh hashivi b'asod hachodesh. The 10th of the month, that's Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim. That's when you blow shofar. And when you blow the shofar, next pasuk, v'kidashtem et shenat hamishim. That's when it becomes holy. And then ukratem b'deror b'chol ha'yoshebeh yovel hi. That will be the Jubilee year. So it doesn't start on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. It starts on the 10th of Tishrei. So why is our Mishnah saying this Rosh Chodesh? Oh, Hamaneh Rabbi Ishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Berokahi. Our Mishnah follows in this detail follows the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan, who we already met yesterday. The Tanya, here's the full source. וקידשתם את שנת 50 שנה, מה תלמוד לומר לפי שנאמר ביום הכיפורים יכול לא תהיה מתקדשת אלא מיום הכיפורים ואילך? תלמוד לומר וקידשתם את שנת 50, מלמד שמקדשת והולכת מתחילתה. Rabbi Ishmael says, you don't wait till Yom Kippur. Yovel starts on Rosh Chodesh, on Rosh Hashana, because it says, the pasuk says that you should make it holy, the 50th year holy. Why do I need this pasuk? It already said Yom Kippurim is when we blow the shofar. So I might have thought if I only had Yom Kippur pasuk that it only becomes holy from Yom Kippur. Therefore, this pasuk v'kidashtem says it becomes automatically holy on its own without anyone having to do anything. Just like Shabbat. Shabbat starts at sunset, even before you say kiddush. It starts by itself. So it starts by, there you go. It starts on Rosh Chodesh. Happens to be on Yom Kippur. We're going to make a big deal out of it and announce it like we do for Kiddush on Shabbat. But it started already before that, according to the Ishmael. Now he has a problem because on this year, after they blow the shofar, all the slaves go free, right? And all the land goes back to its original owner. So when does all this happen? That happens when you make the big announcement on Yom Kippurim. So what happens during the 10 days, the 9 days before that? So he says, from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, the slaves are not sent free to go home because they didn't blow the shofar yet. So it's not officially announced. But they also don't have to serve their masters because the year started. It starts by itself on Rosh Hashanah. So their master could say, go get me a cup of coffee. They said, no, sorry, right? Yovel is already here. So they're in an in-between transition state. Rather, during those 9 days, they still didn't go home yet, but they hang around and they eat and drink and are happy with crowns on their heads. What is crowns on their heads referring to? Well, here's a bust of the Emperor Domitian with a crown of ivy on his heads. And this was done during Roman celebrations, and slaves and free people would celebrate together and put crowns on their heads. So this seems to be imagery that's borrowing from the way Romans celebrated. There's also a famous midrash in Berachot that says, or the Olam Haba, Sadiqim, will be sitting in a circle with crowns on their heads pointing in the middle. Hashem will be dancing. It's famous because Rambam quotes that to say, you can't take all Midrashim literally. Otherwise, you're going to say Hashem is really dancing. And he explains the crowns on their heads is all the Torah that they learned. So it's beautiful how this Roman image becomes allegorized for Torah and spiritual delight. But here, Rabbi Ishmael might be talking literally. This is a symbol of now their freedom. כיוון שהגיע יום הכיפורים, תקעו בית דין בשופר, נפטרו עבדים לבתיהן, ושידות חוזרין ושדות חוזרות לבעליהן. And once Yom Kippur comes, then they can go home, and then the houses and the fields, they go back to their owners. So you see that they have a 10-day transition period, but really Yovel starts on Rosh Chodesh, on Rosh Hashana. All right, good. So now we got his opinion. Let's see how Rabbanan explained it. Rabbanan shanim ata mekadesh v'ata mekadesh chodashim. What is Rabbanan going to do with this pasuk of v'kidashtem et shanat hachamishim? Since they say it only becomes holy on Yom Kippur. So what does it mean that it becomes holy in the 50th year, which sounds like on the beginning of the 50th year by itself? So Rabbanan say, we learned something completely different. That the Bet Din has to sanctify years, but not months. Notice every year that comes, the Bet Din will say, Mikudash, this is a holy year. But regarding months, the majority opinion, which we see in Mishnah, we're going to see in Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, says that every month when they accept the witnesses, the Bet Din says, Mikudash, the head of the Bet Din. Everybody answers, Mikudash, Mikudash. So it's not, they have to declare it so. Whereas not so for months, not so for years. So that's why it says, this is you should sanctify the year, but you don't have to sanctify months. That's what the Rabbanan would learn from this pasuk. Okay, that's all one explanation for how Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbanan interpret this pasuk, and we're going to end today with a second explanation from a different baraita of how they interpret this pasuk. Betanya idach yovelhi. And so this is going on in that same pasuk. It says this is going to be a jubilee year. Why do you have to tell me that this is a jubilee year? It sounds like and not something else. We have to say this year only is the Yovel because you might have thought, just like the 50th year becomes automatically Kadosh from its beginning. So you see, this is following Rabbi Ishmael. And then so too, it continues to be holy even after it finishes. In other words, even into the 51st year, it will continue to be holy until Yom Kippur of the 51st year. You might have thought that. Now, if you're wondering about this, what are you talking about? Why would I think that it should go, that the holiness of Yovel should go into the next year? Al titma, don't be so wondrous. Because even on Shabbat continues, and mitzvah, you're supposed to add some time after Shabbat, and it continues until you declare it finished by saying Havdalah. So too, you might have thought that Yovel continues until Rosh Hashanah on the 51st year. You might have thought that. That's why the pasuk continues and says, Yovel, only the 50th year is Yovel, and it doesn't continue after that. Okay, so that's another version of what Rabbi Ishmael does with this pasuk. But what is Rabbanan going to do with it? Rabbanan, Shenat Chamishim Atamone, Viatamone, Shenat Chamishim Ve'achat. This is a difficult line to read. Tosafot suggests erasing this vav. So let's try it that way. So according to the Rabbanan, it means the 50th year you do count, but you don't count the 50th year as number one of the next cycle. I'll explain it in a second. And this excludes the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. There are two ways of counting Yovel within the Shemitah cycle. The Rabbi Yehuda says when you count 49 years, the next year after 49 serves double duty. It's the Yovel, but it also begins the Shemitah cycle of the next one. So every cycle is only 49 years. There is no 50th year. The 50th year is co-equal to the first year that starts the next cycle. In other words, from Yovel till the next Shemitah will be only 6 years. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who actually we go, most poskim follow this opinion as per halacha, but Rabbanan disagree with that. And they say the 50th year you count, and you do not count the 50th year as one of the next year. So according to Rabbanan, you count 49, you have a Shemitah, and then you have a Yovel, that's 50, and the year after that, you count as one, and you start the new cycle over again. So hopefully soon we can start counting Yovel once again, and then we can learn all these halachot even more in depth and appreciate the cycles and the symbols that they encode. Baruch Adonai L'olam, Amen ve'amen.